In this lecture, I will be explaining what different types of SNOL research look like. So I will be comparing case studies with case comparisons, or the comparative method. So there are two approaches to SNOL research. The first one is called the comparative method, and this is where the number of our cases is larger than one, when we're looking at a comparison between 2 or 3 or 4 or however many cases. So with the comparative method, we test our hypotheses by comparing across different cases and looking at how our cases vary to discern what may cause these different results in the dependent variable. And this contrasts with a single case study. So with a single case study, your N is 1, meaning that you're only looking at one case. However, there is an implicit comparison to a larger universe of cases. So you're not just looking at that one case in isolation, but thinking about that one case as an example of some broader phenomenon. And here we're testing hypotheses, not comparing across different cases, but by looking within the case itself. So we will test our hypothesis by, say, examining variation that we'll see over time, examining variation in embedded units, and using process tracing to examine the causal mechanisms at work. So what did each of these mean? Well, variation over time would be, say, if you were looking at the level of democracy in Mexico and you want to look at the influence of having international human rights groups, how they shape democracy in Mexico, you might look at variation from 1980, before Mexico was democratic, and how the influence of those groups acted over the next 30 years as Mexico becomes increasingly democratic. So your case there is really Mexico, but you're looking over time at how that case changes. Or variation in embedded units could be, if you're looking at a study of Mexico, you could look across different states and do comparisons. So if you're looking at, again, this influence of human rights groups, maybe they're more active in the capital than they are in the state of Oaxaca. And so you can look and see how they are playing out there. And finally, we use process tracing to identify causal mechanisms that might be working. So we're going to have a separate lecture that just looks at process tracing. But process tracing is this process of examining how causal mechanisms play. So we test our hypotheses at various different moments in time to see if our causal argument is playing out the way that we would think that it does. So I'm going to go through and talk a little bit more about what these two different approaches to SNOL research actually look like. So the first one is a study of the comparative method. And here we're going to be comparing the rise of ethnic politics in Latin America. So here I'm going to be discussing a study by Raul Madrid that looks at why you see political parties emerge that have indigenous candidates and advance indigenous rights. We have a comparison here on the left. You'll see Rigoberta Menchú, who is an indigenous woman in Guatemala, who formed a political party, but this party is very, very minor. Despite the fact that a big percentage of the population in Guatemala is indigenous, she was never able to capture more than just a few percentage points in the national presidential election. And compare that with, on the right-hand side, we have a picture from Bolivia of Evo Morales' campaign. So Evo Morales is an indigenous president that was able to win office. And, while both Guatemala and Bolivia have a large percentage of the population that's indigenous, only one of these cases sees the emergence of an indigenous president, one that's able to win votes. And so Madrid's argument is saying that it can't be simply the hypothesis of the percentage of the population that's indigenous. Instead, he looks at how the indigenous movement tries to form alliances with non-indigenous groups. So we see this comparison across the two cases, where in Guatemala, Rigoberta Menchú's movement is really focusing just on indigenous rights and isn't forming alliances with mixed race or white allies. And in contrast, in Bolivia, you see these reaching out efforts to bring in different mestizo, which is what we call mixed race people in Latin America, bring in these different groups into the broader coalition. So it's not simply an indigenous party, but a broad pan-ethnic party. So this is how we see Madrid testing these hypotheses is that he traces out what the path for Guatemala looked like, where she wasn't able to rise to power, and compare that in Bolivia, where you were able to see this indigenous president. And the result is that if you were just to look at one of those in isolation, you'd have less of a picture about how one becomes president as an indigenous party representative in Latin America. But when you compare both of them together, it yields new insights that you might not have thought of. So that is the comparative method. In contrast, you could look just at one study. And so here I'm thinking of Kirk Hawkins' book on populism in Latin America. So he puts it in a broader theoretical framework. He talks about populism across different countries throughout Latin America and throughout the world at different time periods, but then focuses really on Venezuela to try to explain why populism was able to take root in Venezuela. And so to do this study, he's going to be going through and tracing out the process of how Hugo Chavez, who we see here in two different pictures, one in 1998 when he's first running for president, and then later in 2010 or so when he's much more popular and has been president for a while. So how was he able to build up his populist movement? And here he traces through over periods of time how Hugo Chavez was able to build this coalition and develop this base of support. He focuses just on the one case, even though he puts it in a broader perspective. His real analysis is trying to understand Venezuela within a larger context. So why would somebody do this? Why wouldn't you simply analyze multiple cases? And the reason for that is that you have trade-offs that are involved. If you choose to study 2, 3, 4, 8 cases, you're going to have less time and less energy and resources to dedicate to each individual case. And sometimes by really tracing out what's going on very carefully over time with one case in a lot of detail, you're able to yield stronger, more interesting causal analysis. So even if you don't have a comparison, you can still do the kinds of hypothesis testing that we'll see. And so we'll look more at how one does this with single case studies when we get to the lecture on process tracing. Something key to keep in mind is that both the comparative method and single case studies use what we call structured focused comparison. This is at the root of small n research in political science, and is why it would be different than a simple ethnographic study, one that you would do in another discipline. So this means that we still have the causal logic that's at the forefront of what we're trying to do. So what does structured and focused mean? First, structured. This means that we're asking standardized general questions of each case, that we're developing hypotheses that explain not simply our case, but would be applicable to a broader set of cases, and that we are going to be looking at these hypotheses and tracing them out exactly the same for each of them. So for the example of Evo Morales and Rigoberta Menchú, the ethnic politics example that we looked at earlier, Raul Madrid doesn't develop one set of hypotheses to explain Guatemala and another set of hypotheses to explain Bolivia. He develops the exact same hypotheses and applies them for both. So you have this pairing where each variable has to be tested for each case that you have. And these case comparisons or case studies are focused, meaning that they are theoretically motivated and that we are testing hypotheses. So we are analyzing in detail these cases, and we're thinking of them with a larger theory in mind. So even if we are just looking at one case, we're doing so with a strong focus on that one case, but within a larger universe that we're trying to develop some sort of broader theory. We're not coming up with a theory that just explains Venezuela. We're coming up with a theory that explains the emergence of populism in contemporary Latin America, which can apply to other cases, and Venezuela happens to be a particularly excellent case to analyze for that.